Should the Detroit Lions consider making some changes along their offensive line going into free agency, or would it make a little more sense to offer some contracts to players that probably deserve them? Let's talk about that and a whole lot more starting right now. What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Miko, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about two of probably the most important free agents that the Lions are going to have to consider re-signing this upcoming free agency cycle. And now listen, we've already done a couple videos. I've talked about Jared Goff. Morgan and I got together. We talked about the likelihood of the Lions re-signing CJ GJ and got a lot of feedback from, those of you in the comment section and, on social media. But a lot of you kind of were clamoring for having the discussion about the likes of Jonah Jackson. And I decided that if we're going to talk about Jonah Jackson, we should also talk about Graham Glasgow, because both of these guys play very pivotal roles when it comes to this Lions team. So we're going to talk about both guards. We're going to talk about what I believe the Lions should do going into free agency and probably dispel, some opinions or some thoughts about, why the Lions may consider moving on from one or both of these players. So first thing first, let's start with Jonah Jackson, because I feel like he is the hotter name when it comes down to, again, whether the Lions should re-sign him and what type of contract he may command if he's able to hit the open market. Now, Jonah is a former third-round pick. He's been in the league for the last 4 seasons. He's been a Pro Bowler, and he's been one of their more consistent players on that offensive line. And I've kind of said this in the past, when it comes to this left side of the offensive line, when we're talking about Jonah Jackson and we're talking about Taylor Decker, those are two players that I think oftentimes get overlooked just because of how well they play the position. Are they necessarily the top 5 or top 10 at their position? Probably top 10. I think I would put Taylor and both Jonah at top 10 of their position, but because they're not top 5, I think sometimes they get overlooked, especially when we start talking about Frank Ragnow, who's considered arguably the best center in football. Penei Sewell going into his 3rd year, and a lot of people already considering him not just the best right tackle in football, but possibly being the best tackle or best offensive lineman, period, in the NFL. Still, with that being said, Jonah for a 4-year career has been very reliable and very good for this football team. Like I said, he has been a Pro Bowler already, within his short career. And it's one of those things where when you start to look at him as a player and you start to look at what you should expect from your offensive line, one of the most important things for an offensive lineman, I believe, is just consistency, knowing what you're going to get game in and game out. And I think Jonah is the epitome of that. Again, he's not the most physically dominating, especially when, again, talking about the likes of Penei Sewell or necessarily, the most headiest player when we're talking about someone like Frank Ragnow. But Jonah does his job fairly consistently. And through the first 2 years of his, time in Detroit, he was also reliable in the fact of not getting injured, playing all 16 games, and really making his mark in the NFL. Now, the last 2 years, yes, there have been injuries. And I think for a lot of people, that is what is kind of, causing them to pause a little bit when it comes down to whether or not the Lions should, in fact, extend Jonah Jackson. Because, like Ryan Matthews likes to say, the best ability is availability. And Jonah has definitely struggled with that over the last few years. However, while being available is very, very important, we also know that injuries in the NFL are also very unpredictable. And while Jonah may have struggled to get on the field these last couple of years, he hasn't missed long stretches of games, right? Looking at this past year, he missed 3 games in a row. He missed the Tampa game, he missed the Ravens game, and he missed the Raiders game. Of those 3 games, the Lions still went, 2-1 in that stretch. He then came back against the Chargers and then suffered a setback, had to miss the Chicago and Green Bay game, and then came back and finished out the rest of the season. Yes, he did miss the San Francisco 49ers game after sustaining another injury against Tampa Bay in the playoffs, But when I start thinking about, a player being injury prone or a player not being able to stay on the field, these are just kind of like, freak incidents that kind of happen in football. And for him to not miss large stretches of those games and for the Lions to only really suffer three losses in three games in those games that Jonah wasn't there, obviously the playoff, loss being probably the biggest one. I don't think this is something that should be held against him as a reason to not re-sign him. Like I said, Jonah's been very good for this team, and even in limited action this year, or again, not a full slate of performance this year, he was still very good as an offensive lineman. Only giving up 2 sacks on the season, only giving up 14 hurries all season, only giving up 24 pressures all year. Very respectable numbers when you start to look at an offensive lineman and what you want out of your, again, a left guard, someone that you're hoping to, again, be able to be a mover in the run game, also being able to be stout in pass protection and not giving up a lot of sacks. Jonah wasn't somebody that was getting beat up on a lot when he was in the games. And so overall, I don't think the injuries are a big concern when it comes to Jonah Jackson. He is also still very young, which is honestly a big selling point for me as a fan of why I think the Lions should try to re-sign him. Jonah just turned 27 a couple days ago. So we're talking about going into next season, him still only being 27, and you're still going to have so many much more years of him, one, getting better as he gets older, because I feel like offensive linemen in the NFL are almost like fine wines. They seem to get better with age, especially interior offensive linemen. So Jonah still, in my mind, hasn't even hit his prime years yet of playing offensive guard in the NFL. He still has so much more time to get better. And I think by keeping him with Hank Fraley, keeping him, in between Frank Ragnow and Taylor Decker and allowing those guys to continue to get better, as the years go on, is only going to be more beneficial for him. Now, the question becomes, okay, when you're talking about an offensive lineman who has been a Pro Bowler, who is still fairly young, who is still playing at a high level, what is the monetary investment that you should make? And I think, again, whenever we talk about free agency, obviously what a player is demanding versus what a team is able to pay is going to be a huge selling point. For Jonah, though, I do believe that Jonah is worth, at a minimum, in my opinion, 13 million a year. Now, I don't know if, again, after coming off a season where he definitely missed some games and coming off of back-to-back seasons where he's missed at least 4 games, yes, that's going to be a hard selling point probably for his agents. But when you, again, you look at the fact that he's young, you look at what he's accomplished in the league, I do think if the Lions were to be giving him a 3 to 4 year deal where he's getting anywhere between 13 to maybe 15, maybe 16 million a year, isn't a bad investment for a unit on your offense that is the best unit, that is the most important unit on your football team. There are still many fans out there that believe that one of the reasons that Jared Goff has been able to have this resurgence in his career is because of the fact that he has such a great offensive line in front of him. And I think the running game is probably the best evidence of that is over the last couple of years. Yes, they've switched out the running backs, but the offensive line has only gotten better and better as they've been able to gel and be, have that cohesion amongst themselves. So keeping Jonah on this team and keeping that cohesion, I think is something that is very, very important and worth investing in, probably a little bit more so than you would in other positions. In other positions, I do think you could probably have that luxury to be like, you know what, we're going to shop around and see if we can find, a better deal or something that's not going to, cost us double digits, per year when we're talking about, again, over 10 million a year. But Jonah is someone that, like I said, young, has continued to be a very good run blocker, has started to grow and improve as a pass blocker, as we saw this past season. And like I said, he still, in my opinion, hasn't hit his prime years. So if you can still make that big investment, yes, but again, have it for 4, maybe, at a minimum 3 years, you're still getting him before, he's able to come out of those prime years, maybe getting into his mid 30s, you're able to still harness those prime years of his career. So that is my outlook when it comes to Jonah Jackson. In my opinion, he is worth re-signing. Going back to this past offseason, I was of the opinion that he was more important to extend than even Jared Goff was at that time. And I'm still kind of feeling that way. even after him having the season he had, where I said where he wasn't fully healthy, I still think he's that important to this team's success going forward. He is worth that investment. And I don't know if you're going to guarantee yourself an upgrade at his position specifically. And I'm looking at him individually when you're talking about maybe looking in free agency or even drafting someone as high as the first round. I don't know if you're guaranteeing yourself an opportunity to upgrade over what Jonah has brought you over the last 4 years. Now, with that said, let's transition over to Graham. And having Graham back in Detroit, I think, was one of the better things for not just him, but also this fan base to be able to see a former player that a lot of us loved while he was here. Obviously, a local kid playing at the University of Michigan, being a Detroit Lion for all those years, and being very good and consistent, even once the Lions drafted Frank and Graham had to make that transition over to guard. He was always willing to do what the team asked him to do. So to be able to see him come back, as a more seasoned veteran, going into that camp battle with Halapoli Vati, and after week 1 not getting the start, but getting the start in week 2 and being another consistent fixture of this offensive line, I think it's once again another no-brainer that the Lions should be looking to re-sign Graham, coming back into, another season here in Detroit. Now, the difference between him and Jonah, first and foremost, is age, right? Graham has Jonah by 4 years. He's already 31, kind of, maybe at the tail end of his prime years, maybe still has a couple really good years of football left in him. And so you're probably not looking at the same long-term investment when I'm talking about 3 to 4 years for Jonah. You're probably looking more like 2 to 3 when you're talking about Graham. And I still think you can get Graham at a really good deal. Currently, this past season, he was making just over $2 million a year. I think it was like $2.7 million a year. I don't think it's ridiculous to kind of see Graham bump that number up to maybe 5, maybe 6 million a year. And again, giving him that over a 2 to 3 year deal and allowing him to play out the rest of his career here in Detroit until he decides that he wants to retire, or again, until the Lions decide, you know what, we have another upgradable player that they've either been, grooming via the draft, or they decide to just find another player in free agency at the end of his deal. So that's what I think the Lions could potentially do when it comes to Graham's contract situation. But the reason I think he's worth re-signing is kind of very similar to what I was saying about Jonah, in the fact of like when Graham was available, which he was for much of this past season, never missed a game outside of not starting week 1. He was consistently healthy, played both guard and center, especially in those games where, Frank went down with a couple injuries and Graham had to slide over to center. He has that versatility you want, and it's not a huge drop off. It's not like when Graham slides over to center, you look at him as like, oh, this is clearly a backup center. No, Graham still plays center at a very high level. But when he's at guard next to Panay and next to Frank, he seems to be even better. And obviously that's because he's probably playing next to 2 of the best players at their respective positions, which makes Graham's job a lot easier. It sometimes also makes it more difficult, and we saw Graham struggle at times with certain matchups and sometimes giving up more pressures. When you start to compare his numbers to Jonah's numbers, Graham absolutely gave up more pressures, gave up more hurries, gave up more sacks. And it's not just because Graham played, 4 to 5 more games. Like it's astronomically more, right? It's more than double what Jonah gave up. And so I do think, again, the Lions could have this long-term approach to being like, hey, we still want to help, a player like Kobe Sorsdahl continue to grow and get better. And maybe that's the player that you're looking to replace Graham in a couple years. But I still think Graham is someone that you want to have in place, because that is, again, like I was talking about with Jonah, that cohesion is something that you just don't want to try to mess with. And I do think like this offensive line is a tight-knit group. I do think that they would welcome in any new fresh face and get them acclimated. But when that chemistry is already built in, when Graham already has a relationship with Frank, he has a relationship with Taylor and Jonah, and obviously building that relationship with Panay, that is something that is, again, why mess with that? Why mess with a good thing? I guess that's essentially what I'm saying. Something that is working so efficiently both in the run and pass game. I don't think it's worth messing up just so that you can potentially find a more, a better deal, or just because you think you can find a better talent in the draft. Again, if you can, that's great. I just don't know if that's going to circumvent what you currently have, which is a really, really strong unit, arguably, and maybe not even arguably at this point, the best offensive line unit in the NFL right now. And so, with all that said, I do think, like I said, the Lions are going to have some really tough decisions when it comes more so to Jonah, because I think it really is going to come down to the numbers of like how much money is he expecting. As a third round pick, he hasn't made a lot of money. I think this past year he only made like 1.1 million, I think, on this contract this past season. And so obviously Jonah's going to be looking to make a sizable jump in his pay, and based off his resume, he deserves that. Graham, on the other hand, I do think they have more wiggle room to find a team friendly deal that not just makes him happy, but also keeps the Lions in a flexible position to where they can be able to sign more of their younger players to long-term contracts. But very much so, I think Jonah should be looked at in that same way. The same way that we look at, hey, the Lions are going to have to pay big money to keep Saint in a couple years. They're going to have to pay a big money to keep Panay in a couple years. The same with Hutch in a few years. Jonah should very much be in this team's, view of, hey, players that we want to keep long term. And another reason I say that, when especially talking about Graham and Jonah, is because the players that you have behind them, Colby Sorzal, Coyote Awasika, those guys, again, played this year mainly because Jonah missed some time, because Frank missed some time, and they had to, play a couple games or play a couple snaps here and there. Did decent jobs at times, but you could clearly see the drop off, right? You know how I talked about like Graham slides over to center? It doesn't really feel like you're dealing with a backup center. Well, when Coyote Awasika came in, or when Colby Sorsdal came in, you very much knew you were dealing with backup guards. You were very much aware that you were dealing with guards that didn't have starting experience and weren't really familiar with playing against high level talent. So in my mind, it just continues to make more sense to, keep your star players that are starting for you and continue to work on that depth, because I think, yes, maybe in the near future, you may need better depth, and you may need players that can actually, start for a player like Graham Glasgow, or you may need someone, if Jonah continues to struggle here and there with availability. You still want to have quality players behind them, but I don't think you want to try and replace a starter and still try to find quality depth. That seems like creating more work for yourself than what is necessary. So again, long story short, yes to re-signing Jonah Jackson. I do believe he is worth, top tier money in his position. Maybe not quite the most in his position, but definitely in that range between, like I said, 13 to 16 million. And yes to Graham Glasgow. And I think, like I said, you can find a really team-friendly number that I think Graham would be happy with. Going back to this offseason, he even talked about how he was just happy to be back in Detroit and to be able to play with his friends. So I don't think the negotiation process should be that difficult for a player like Graham Glasgow. So those are my thoughts when it comes down to the Lions, free agents on the offensive line. But I want to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comment section below. What do you think the Lions should do when it comes to Jonah Jackson? Would you pay him, somewhat near top tier money, or would you let him walk? The same with Graham Glasgow. Do you think his veteran presence is something that the Lions need to be trying to retain? Or do you think they should also be looking to upgrade his position and still probably even draft a future, rookie or asset to continue to help shore up their depth on the offensive line? Also, be sure to head over to pridedetroit.com. We are uploading all these new articles in this offseason. We're doing our own free agent analysis over there on the website, where they've already put out articles on Josh Reynolds, Graham Glasgow as well. I believe they've even talked about CJ over on the website. So there's a lot of really good content, especially if you're looking for insight into what the Lions could be doing come free agency or come the draft. And last but not least, please be sure to hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel. That stuff helps out this channel immensely, but more importantly, it keeps you aware when we upload new content or when we decide to go live over here on YouTube. So with all that said, I'm Miko. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.